Hi, this is part one for the lecture for Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is entitled Savings, Investments, and the Financial System. What we're basically going to learn here, the learning objective, is what are the major types of financial institutions in the United States. We're going to learn what they are and what the functions are. What are the three kinds of savings? Saving. What's the difference between savings and investments? How does the financial system coordinate savings and investments? And how do government policies affect savings, investments, and the interest rate? You could read this on your own, the purpose. Let's move on. Financial institutions, financial systems. What is a financial system? It's a group of institutions in the economy that helps match one person's savings with another person's investment. What? It's basically institutions fancy way of companies, I guess, that matches one person who wants to save a dollar and another person who wants to borrow a dollar, effectively. Okay. So why is investment borrowing? Because we usually think of somebody who wants to go out and buy a house, they have to borrow money because they don't have the full amount of money to buy the house. They borrow money to buy a house. Same thing for buying a business or buying machines for the business. Usually people don't have all that money on hand, so they have to borrow money. A bank is one type of financial institution. You and I, we put money in there. Okay, that's our savings that we put in there. And that's the supply of the money. In investments, well, what they do is companies go to the bank and borrow money. They're demanding money. Okay. And that's the investment. Okay. So there's financial institutions, what we talked about here, institutions through which savers can directly provide funds to borrowers. Okay. One example, financial markets and intermediaries. Okay, these are examples of those. What is a financial market? Let's go to the next one. Financial institutions through which savers can directly provide funds to the borrower. There's no middleman here. That's what a financial market is. It's like you and I go out and we could buy um, bonds, which is fancy way of saying debt, from companies. And what does that even mean? That's basically a fancy way of saying companies such as Google, they'll go to the a marketplace, kind of think of it as like a swap meet and say, I want to borrow money. Who wants to give me money? Okay, so I could borrow it. And you and I will go to the same swap meet market and we will lend Google money. There's no one in the middle. Okay. The bond market is what I just described. What is a bond? It's a certificate of indebtedness that specifies the obligations of the borrower to the buyer of the bond. It's a fancy way of saying it's a loan, but a loan is from a bank. When it's not from a bank, but a loan is directly coming from the person who gives the money, that's called a bond. And it gives a bunch of fancy details like date of maturity, when the loan has to be repaid by, rate of interest. Well, when I give you money, I want something back. I need something to give you money. And I get interest payments, 10%, 5% interest. Okay. It's paid periodically. Well, how periodic? Monthly, yearly, daily? Until the I pay them until the company pays the loan back. And the principal amount, that's the fancy word for amount being borrowed. All right, borrowing from the public, used by large corporations, the federal government, states, and local government. All of these, they go directly to the public, people like you and I, and go to the bond market. They go to the bond market where you and I could go and give them money. They borrow money from us. Okay. And these bonds differ according to characteristics. Some are very long term, some are short term, months, some are long term, 10, 30 years. Some never mature. They're perpetual. Okay. Long term bonds are riskier than short term. Yeah. Okay. How long if I borrow money, or if I borrow money for 30 years compared to 30 days, I have more chance of dying, my business failing. It's more risky. So long-term bonds usually pay higher interest rates. Okay. Credit risk. What is credit risk? The probability of default. Okay. It's trying to measure what is the probability that default, meaning not paying back the money that was being borrowed. What is the probability of not getting paid back or not paying someone back? That is the credit risk. Okay. If someone has high credit risk, well, you're going to have to entice me with higher interest rate to lend you money. US government is generally considered one of the safest places to lend money to, and they generally pay low interest rate. Junk bonds have very high interest rates. These are bonds issued by companies that have real higher probability of defaulting. Okay, they have high probability of not paying back the money, so they have to offer higher interest rates compared to, say, a well-established company like Google or Facebook, or especially the US government. Okay? Tax treatment. Interest on most bonds is taxable income. Okay, just heads up, when you borrow money, I mean, not borrow money, but when you lend money to Google, you lend them $100, and Google says, "Hey, don't worry, I'm going to give you 10% interest." That means you made $110, say 1 year from now. Well, the $10 you made off the interest income, because remember, 10% of $100 is $10. You have to pay some of that to Uncle Sam in taxes. But municipal bonds issued by state and local government, you don't have to pay federal taxes on that. And state and local government knows this. And so they only offer a lower interest rate. Okay, they know, hey, you don't have to pay taxes, so I don't have to entice you as much. Okay. There's some bonds out there has inflation protection. The federal government offers some of that, Treasury inflation protected securities, and these are indexed to a measure of inflation. When prices rise, the payments of these bonds also goes up. So you don't have to worry, right? TIPS is short for Treasury inflation protected security. All right, another type of market is called the stock market. This is the market that you guys probably heard more of. Stocks is not a bond. Stock is a claim of partial ownership in a firm, and more importantly, a claim of the profits that the firm makes. Stock is owning a piece of a company. Okay, so let's say Google offers $100. Google says, "Hey, give me $100 in bonds or $100 in stocks." When you give them $100 in, when you buy their bond for $100, so you're basically lending them $100. You're letting Google borrow $100 from you. Okay. When you buy $100 of stocks in Google, you're buying a piece of ownership of Google. Okay. So one way for Google to finance its operation is equity finance, sell stocks to raise money. Another way is debt finance. Okay, you sell bonds to raise the money. Okay. Now you have organized stock exchanges. It's like NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange are the two big ones in the US. Okay. And these are and what is an organized stock exchange? It's just a fancy word of saying it's a big swap meet where you could go to buy and sell stocks. You trade stocks then. Okay? Stock price, the definition of that is determined by the supply and demand for the price in these companies. And the stock price, okay, is the price of one share of the stock, okay, of the company. Stock index, what is that? It's basically, I don't know if you heard of Standard and Poor's 500, Dow Jones Industrial Averages, okay? Dow Jones, or sometimes they call it Dow Jones 30. And it's basically a measure of the performance of the top 500 companies for Standard and Poor's. And Dow Jones is basically like the top 30 companies, right? Let's move on. Financial intermediaries. Okay. What are financial intermediaries? Financial institutions through which savers can indirectly provide funds to borrowers. Financial intermediaries are middlemen that link savers with borrowers, or at least the money. Because you and I, when we put money into Bank of America, we are the savers, and Bank of America then lends the money to the borrowers. We never meet the borrowers ourselves. The big ones are banks and mutual funds. What are banks? Banks, you and I know what, I hopefully know what banks are. They take deposit from savers. Okay, bank pays us a little bit of interest because we put our money in there, and they make loans to borrowers, and they charge the borrowers a bigger interest. So, for example, if the bank only pays us 3% and the bank charges the borrower 6%, that means the bank makes money, they make 3%. Okay, that's the difference that the bank makes. That's their money, their income. Okay, let's move on. Secondary role for banks, what is it? It facilitates purchases of goods and services by issuing checks, debit cards to access deposits. Okay. So when you and I had to buy stuff, we could go and use our credit card, we could use our checking account, and we could use a debit card. And when you use your checking account, debit card, you're basically using the money you saved up in Bank of America real quickly right there at the store. You don't have to go to an ATM, take money out, and pay them. You have it right there. You have quicker access to the money you put into Bank of America. All right. Also, the bank offers the median of exchange. That's a fancy way of saying it gives you these checks and debit cards to kind of exchange, and store of value. Okay. So your money that stays in Bank of America, it stays there and it still maintains that same value. Okay. All right, what is a mutual fund? It's an institution that sells shares to the public and uses the proceeds to buy a portfolio of stocks and bonds. Okay. There's a lot of mutual funds out there. The big players are like Vanguard, T. Rowe Price. These are large companies, and what they do is they allow the smaller people like me to be able to buy little pieces of a lot of companies. And why would I do that? Advantage allows people with small amounts of money to diversify their holdings, less risk, gives ordinary people access to the skills of professional money managers. That's the other thing. Okay. So what do I mean by less risk? If I go out and I have let's say I only have $100 and I could only buy one company share, Google or Facebook or Amazon or Tesla. If I went and bought Google stocks, I am subject to all the risk associated with Google. If Google's CEO did a bad move, I have all that 100% risk in my $100. But if I go and use the $100 to buy a mutual fund, what they do is they use the $100, my $100, your $100, and everybody else's $100, and they buy some of Google, some of Facebook, some of Tesla, some of Amazon. That means now my risk is divided up into the five companies that I mentioned. Yeah, if Google goes down, I still am kind of protected because I have the performance of Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, etc. Okay. So it allows me to diversify my money, which reduces my risk. And oh, by the way, mutual funds, if they're managed by professionals, we get access to these fancy people in Wall Street who do fancy things to try to make us more money. However, there's also a different type of mutual fund. They're called index funds. It allows people like us to maybe not buy a professionally managed fund, but an index fund. And an index fund tries to match an index. And what is the index? It's something we discussed here, above here. Dow Jones average, the performance of the top 30 companies, or Standard and Poor's 500, the performance of the top 500 companies. Okay, this one is the top 30, so it's more risky. This one, top 500, it's less risky, but the return is likely lower because you have lots of little companies in there and lots of different companies in there. Okay. All right. National income account. What is that? The rule of national income accounting. It's an important identity. What is okay? What is an identity? An equation that must be true because of the way the variables in the equations are defined. An identity is just it's a true equation. It always is true. All right, so let's go to this accounting identity. GDP, gross domestic product, we use Y for that. And what we're saying is in the world, okay, let's look for a simple, uh, our total income has to equal to our total expenditure. Let's say for the United States. And we talked about this before. Y, GDP, has to equal to, this is our production, has to equal to the consumption, okay, what you and I purchase, investments, what companies, you know, buy in terms of investing in like warehouses and machines and all that stuff. Government, what government buys, and net exports, which is plus exports minus imports. Why minus imports? Because it's money we give to other countries to buy their stuff. In a closed economy, this is zero right here. Okay. This is zero. So a closed economy, we only have this. Okay. That's because we don't interact with other countries around the world. All right, in an open economy, this is not zero. Okay, net exports is not zero. That's what it says here. Closed economy, open economy, that's the only difference. Let's move on. So for now, let's just assume a closed economy to do our analysis. Okay, net exports equal to zero, so we have this remaining from above. Okay, so what is national savings? Let's define S as national savings. And we're going to define it with this. Total income in the economy that remains after paying for consumption and government purchases. Okay, so we're going to define S as what we have left over after consumers eat and the government buys tanks. So S is Y minus C minus G. This is S. And what do we have on the right-hand side of the equation? Just I left over. We put C on this side, we put G on this side. So that is S. So S is equal to this. So we have S is equal to I. This is your saving is equal to investment identity. Okay. Now we're going to introduce a new term, T, taxes minus transfers. Taxes collected by the government minus what are transfers? Payments that the government makes to, like, say, Social Security, to welfare system, food stamps, stuff like that. Okay. So tax T is taxes minus transfer. Well, let's look at this. S is equal to Y minus, okay, wait, minus T minus C plus GT minus G. What? What is this? Okay. Well, remember, S is equal to Y minus C minus G. Okay, so savings is Y, output or income, minus consumption. Well, for consumption, okay, let's write this out. When you put taxes minus transfers in here, okay, consumers, okay, they lose taxes. And they have to pay taxes. Okay? And the government, they make taxes. Okay, that's their income. Government, they make income or they make taxes. So we could rewrite this as Y minus C minus T. Okay, because consumers, they want to buy stuff, but they also have to pay taxes, minus G plus T. All right. And this is equal to S. So then we say S is equal to Y minus C minus T. That is this part. Okay. That is this. Sorry for the confusion. I should have rewrote this part. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That is not that part. Okay. This is, let me erase this. Okay. Okay. S is equal to Y minus C plus T. Sorry. The minus sign goes in there. Minus G minus T. So that's basically, I put the minus sign inside. So then I could rewrite this as S is equal to Y minus T, got it from here, minus C, okay, okay. And then I could group another term, which is plus T minus G, okay? And that is here, that is this, that is this, and here is this, okay? All right, so let me take all that out to make it less ugly. This here is what we call private savings. Y minus T minus C is private savings. Okay, income minus taxes minus consumption is what you and I as households we save. Okay, let's move on. Gotta clear all this. Okay, so there's income for the households have left after paying taxes and consumption, right? Public savings is this part right here. T is what government brings in as revenue, tax income, minus what they spend on tanks. G, that's public saving. Okay? So the government, they bring in tax revenue and whatever they spend, whatever's after left over, that's their saving. If T minus G is positive, they have what's called a budget surplus because the government's revenue, tax revenue, is greater than their spending. Government is actually saving money. If T minus G is less than zero, we have a budget deficit. And that's generally what we've been seeing in the US for the last many, many years. Okay. That's a shortfall of tax revenue from government spending. We have the government is basically not saving, it's doing the opposite. Okay, it's basically borrowing, right? We are done with part one of the lecture for chapter 18. Okay, have a good day.